meet our incredible guest, nutrition coach and founder of Evidence Nutrition, Edin Sehovic, who has helped coached and transformed people to becoming the best version of themselves and in achieving their fitness goals. Get ready to break a sweat and ignite your weight management journey like never before. Listen to his truly inspirational discussion in nutrition and tackling obesity. He has all the tips and tricks you need. Let's make 2024 the year we tackle obesity together. See you there.
In behalf of our host, Richard Walker, let's welcome Russ Allen and our guest, Edin Sehovic. Together, let's tackle obesity.
Welcome to another episode of Tackle Obesity Show. Hi, it's Russ Allen. I'm the pitch hitting coach for my partner, Richard Walker, who is not available today. And our guest today is Edin Sehovic. I'm sorry. And Edin is, has kind of a unique profile as a coach and as a trainer in this area. And I'll let him go into the details. But, in dealing with people with obesity and being overweight, one of the number one things that falls off that hill is type 2 diabetes. And we like to say type 2 diabetes is the most treatable chronic disease probably there is, because you're able in many cases to reverse the condition with intervention and weight loss. Unfortunately, Edin is not able to do that because he's type 1, and I can let him go into it. But yeah, right. Why don't you go into your story and what brought you to this point in your life and being able to share with us?
Yeah, for sure. First of all, thank you for having me. It's when I was 14 years old, which is now over, like I've been a diabetic for a majority of my life now. And I was diagnosed, quite late on in my life. When I was 14 years old, my mom was going to start a new job the next day. I had just gone to the doctor the day before, and we get a call late at night. I was probably, it was a Thursday going on a Friday. So, call it Friday at 1 a.m. And we get a call from the doctor's office or from the lab saying, "Hey, you got to go to the hospital." So we go to the local children's hospital, and I always I've told this story on TikTok a few times. I don't know how many of my followers have even seen it, but the doctor walked into the room, and I'll never forget the moment when he said, "Hey, man, life sucks sometimes," and that was his opening line. Didn't even introduce himself yet. So I hope his bedside manner has improved since, but it was a memorable moment because my doctor had always told me, you're either going to have nothing or you're going to have pancreatic cancer or diabetes. And I was like, well, I certainly hope it's not the latter two, but, we'll see what it is. For those of you that are unfamiliar, diabetes forced me to lose a lot of weight in a short period of time, which at that time I didn't have anything to lose. I was a very scrawny kid. And I went from about 120-ish pounds to about 85. Not a buck 85, that's just 85. And so I was quite skinny. My mom was quite concerned. I was going to the bathroom and drinking water, and then urinating, drinking water, urinating. So that was kind of the telltale sign of my diabetes story. And then from then on in, I was always an athletic kid. I played tennis at a semi-professional level and growing up. And so I always was interested, and I got the pleasure through diabetes of learning how nutrition affected disease, which affected sport performance, which affected, all sorts of different aspects of my life. For example, when I'm doing a podcast like this, and if I get nervous, I already know that I'll be sweating and rambling and doing whatever, but that also happens to me when I have a low blood sugar. So I got the pleasure of learning more about my body than most people do, very early on in life. And I say that genuinely, because if it wasn't for that, I probably wouldn't have gone down the route of getting a bachelor's in nutrition and dietetics. And then after that, I specialized in sport nutrition and kind of worked with the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, and I've been making videos and content to try to educate people on evidence-based nutrition practice on social media for the last 3 or 4 years. And it's constantly growing and it's been great ever since, for sure.
Oh, wonderful. I went to UC Berkeley and did a
big
double
nutrition school too.
in psychology and exercise physiology. So the mind and body. And I was, and I ended up working as a volunteer on campus. They actually had a hospital at that time on UC Berkeley's campus. And I met a couple of guys who were students, but they were living in the hospital because they were quadriplegic and they had broken their necks. So at the end of my sophomore year, they approached me and said, Russ, we want to move out into our own apartment. And but we need somebody to live with us in case something goes wrong. Also, they do the cooking and the shopping and the cleaning and, the good wife stuff, right? So I was at that point thinking I would go into physical therapy. And I thought, wow, this is a really unique opportunity to work and live with someone who is dealing with, a significant disability. I mean, one gentleman was a C4, which is a very high break, and the other was 5-6. So both of them had very limited movement. But what I learned from that most importantly was their hopes and dreams didn't change. Yeah. They wanted the same things out of life that I wanted. They wanted to be able to have a family, have a job, a career, something meaningful. And that's what they live for, even dealing with this severe disability. And this was in 1973, 74. So we did the sit-ins, and I was not a leader in any way. I just showed up for the ADA movement. And so we got the laws passed first in California that then subsequently were passed nationally after another sit-in, and which I wasn't involved in. But I saw a transformation of our culture around a specific medical condition that, was obviously extreme. And, but it really, so what we've been doing with the Tackle Obesity initiative is, we're really focused on obesity as a medical condition, not a character flaw. And same thing with diabetes, right? I mean, you didn't ever say, man, I would love some of that.
Join the club. Come on.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It just landed in your lap. And
exactly.
Honestly, of the chronic conditions, there are some more severe ones that you could be a very grateful man. And having seen, the lifestyle of folks who are dealing with that. But they don't change as human beings. The bottom line is we have that same heart and nature and hope that we can fulfill our lives. And I got to know a man named Ed Roberts, who he was a victim of polio. And so he spent 16 hours a day in an iron lung. Wow. And then the rest of the time he would what's called frog breathe. So he'd gulp air and swallow it with his larynx, not with his lungs, because they were really useless in terms of those muscles. And Ed ended up being appointed as the head of the Department of Voc Rehab for the entire state of California. So at that time, I was doing a business that I started out of my bedroom, designing equipment that would enable severely disabled to do something in their daily life they wanted to be able to do. Wow. Whether it was open a door, take a leak, open a can, cook some eggs, whatever.
Yeah, the simple things. Yeah.
But the big things, right?
Yeah, and for sure.
Good example is, one of the guys, he couldn't empty his leg bag. And for those that don't know, when you're dealing with that kind of disability, they capture the urine in a bag that's secured to your leg. So imagine being a student in college, having to approach someone in the middle of the day on campus saying, could you please reach down and undo my clamp on my leg bag so I can relieve myself so I can go on to my next class. Otherwise, I got to go all the way home, have my attendant meet me. It was a nightmare. And you would, I saw firsthand. So I actually invented a little clamp that would allow them to use a leather strap, and they just cut a hole in their jeans, right? And the loop was out of their jeans, but at that time it was Hippieville, so nobody even thought anything of it. And he would go over next to a storm drain and be able to empty that leg bag. Changed his life. Because
I can imagine.
All day long without having to worry about that. So I know that you've made adjustments in your life dealing with the diabetes. I'd love to hear about that. How has it affected your ability to manage your weight and the lessons you've learned?
So, yeah, a super interesting story, actually, that you reminded me of right there. One of my, really one of my formative lessons that I learned that I'm only realizing kind of now that, and in the last few years, he came up not too long ago, a teacher of mine in high school. Before I knew what I wanted to get into, I knew I wanted to get into something athletic or something like that. I know my parents would have wanted me to be a classic engineer or doctor or something of that nature. And while I love being handy with my hands, I'm just, let's face the music, not good at it. So, it is what it is. But I had a teacher called Mr. Zwolak. We named him, or we called him Mr. Zwolak. So if he ever ends up seeing this, hi, sir. He was really transformative because he taught me the beginner or intro to kinesiology in high school. And he was also, I believe, a C4 or C5 or 6 quadriplegic as well. So that was, to me, one of the best classes I've ever learned, because I got to learn about how the body moves from someone who literally cannot move theirs. With the exception of, he could make small movements, like I think one of his pecs could move a small amount, but everything from there on up.
Boy, he was very high break. Yeah, very high break.
Yeah, it was very, very, very high break. So that was a very.
That could have been a C3. Wow, that's really. That could have been a C3 or a partial. That's very.
Yeah, I think it was a C4. But anyways, I'm not gonna. I'm sure he'll correct me, and when I see him, when I visit back home, I'm sure I'll see him again, and he'll remind me, like,
awesome.
But it was really interesting to me that was my first moment where, and that happened at a timely manner about 2-3 years after I was diagnosed with diabetes. You're still you're a teenager, you're in the woe is me kind of phase of your life. And at that time, CGMs were not really a thing, but pumps were. And I was always anti-pump. And that was after that class ended, I then, ended up having one more year, I believe, or like a summer or something. And then I decided I wanted to get on a pump, because I decided, well, much like Mr. Zwolak, he, has things that he just can't change, right? He had a bike accident. He was mountain biking. He had an accident. He enjoyed his life before that moment. He's still enjoying his life now. And it's just different. So, it was in that moment that I realized, okay, I can't get my healthy pancreas back. I can't inject anything into it. I tried countless, Western, Eastern medicines, everything under the sun, to, try to reverse my diabetes. It wasn't going anywhere. And that was also the moment I realized I wanted to do only things that were evidence-based and really look at the science. And I spent a lot of time reading scientific literature, which helped me later on in university to get better at interpreting data. So again, diabetes helped me in, my education later on in life. But after that, I kind of realized, okay, well, if I can take care of myself a little bit better, then I can do the things that I still wanted to do anyways and feel more normal. And then I got on a pump, which I'm not on now, but that's just because I'm kind of in a transition period between pumps. So as you can see, I have some injections here, but I'm still on a CGM. So that kind of started a trend of me.
Sorry, for the audience, what is a CGM?
Oh, sorry. So yes, thank you. So a pump, by the way, administers this through a little vessel into your body, so that you don't have to inject in public all the time, which takes away from the social stigma of it all, as well as you don't have to take your pants off in public, which is a plus. Who would have thought that's a plus? And a CGM is this thing on my arm that utilizing it's called a continuous glucose monitor. So utilizing my phone, I can just tap it to here and find out exactly where my blood sugars are, and therefore administer the right amount of insulin according to where I'm at and what I'm doing. So that takes away from, again, another social stigma, but a very inconvenient process of having to poke your finger all the time. Yeah. So growing up,
just to put context to it, it isn't once; it's like 4 or 5 times a day. You end up having to do that in certain cases.
And if you're trying to be physically active, and type 2 diabetics can relate to this because they have to do it as well. If you're trying to be physically active, it only means you have to do it more often. So you you immediately start tying physical activity to, oh, I gotta be bloody more often, and then you're getting blood on things you don't want to get blood on. People are grossed out in public, and then on top of that, it hurts, right? Like by the end of, if you take a steaming hot shower and your hands get wrinkly, like you can see the points of which you've been drawing blood from. So it's a frustrating process, and I'm super thankful that the technology has improved. Definitely a life-changing technology for sure.
There you go. Yeah. Well, I got so many questions I want to ask you. By the way, I bought the book you suggested, Flexible Dieting. I Kindle it.
I got it right here.
Yeah. So I can't wait to weigh into it, because it sounds really kind of written in a little bit scientific as well as practical. And, one of the campaigns we're running is to educate, especially young people, about ultra processed foods, because more and more evidence is emerging that this is almost irrefutably the source of much of our obesity problem, is the Western diet. And the obviously, you were discussing it, but it's really about and not eating things that have all of the additives and the sugars. And sugar can be named 100 different things nowadays. They cloak it. That's why in the new food labeling, they make them label added sugars as one of the elements, because they were changing the names of things and so on. So love to just your whole experience about you're an Evidence Nutrition is the name of your company, and maybe you can elaborate about what we call FUP food, fatten you up food, or F is another word, but anyway, fatten you up for the sake of the PG audience, right?
For sure.
Yeah.
So thank you. I did start Evidence Nutrition, which is also my my Instagram and my TikTok and my YouTube handle is at Evidence Nutrition. And also shout out to Alan Aragon. I just recently put up a post with him, which is kind of like a life goal of mine. So shout out to him for allowing me to collaborate with him on something like that. Back to your original question. The interesting thing is, a lot of that literature comes out, and it's important to interpret it in the way that it's conducted. And literature is kind of complicated to conduct because, it's expensive. It takes a long time to get good data. It takes a really long time, which just makes it even more expensive. And it's quite challenging to keep someone in their normal lifestyle and keep it applicable. For example, you can't just take, we always want a study to be 100, 200, 5,000 people, but what's the reality of a few scientists in a lab? And we're talking 2 or 3 people is normally in the lab setting, and maybe you have a few assistants here and there, but they're all students, and they have to be local because they're local to a university, which is what got the funding. And how do you keep those people accountable to whatever dietary intervention you're putting them on? So it makes it quite challenging. So, interpreting the scientific literature is very challenging to see what applies and what doesn't. But what we do know is, aside from a few other factors, obesity is multifactorial, but it could be genetic related, it could be lifestyle related, and that people are more sedentary. I live in Canada, but in the US and Canada, we're quite similar in that you are driving 90% of where you're going. And very few cities exist, like New York still, where you can walk everywhere you go, maybe transit a little bit. So people in general are not walking that often. And then the other thing is the US significantly is further ahead than any other country I've ever visited in the amount of options you have for processed foods. So while back in the day, that was life-changing, life-altering, think back to the 1930s, think back to the 1940s, where we didn't have any food. So, handing someone a Twinkie, not that I'm throwing shade at Twinkie, but throw them a Twinkie and they'd be like, oh my God, thank goodness I have food, right? Thank goodness I have some calories to survive. Now, from the 1960s, 70s onwards, we have less of an issue of malnutrition. It still exists in some parts of the world and some parts of the US as well, but malnutrition looks different now. It's not just you have no food, and now it's just you have inadequate nutrition, in the sense that you don't get, the adequate amount of micronutrients or the adequate amount of protein, for example, or something of that nature. So it's no longer a matter of I don't have enough to eat to survive. It's now I don't have enough of the right things in the right order, to eat to survive, if that makes sense. So that's drastically changed the landscape of health and wellness and what we do on social media to try to help to educate people. The other thing about ultra processed foods is they're very easy to overeat because most of them, while yes, they're high in sugars, they're high in fats, they're very convenient. Most of us can keep them in the cupboards, or sometimes people have a cookie jar, or sometimes people have a basket on the table, and then it's kept at eye level. If you see it all the time, if you pass by it 5, 6, 7, 8 times throughout the day, you're going to grab a little bit, right? So it's a lot easier and more convenient for you to grab excess calories when perhaps you might not think it. And that's a big thing that I have to chat about.
Aren't they designed in part to be addictive in the brain response, the mental response? Because they are crafted to appeal visually, and then the experience of eating, and then the dopamine response when you get that sugar hit with the salt, and then typically, and then you're getting your carbs with it's like it's very difficult for people.
I would love to, like, I agree with you on that, but I also would love to challenge that notion. And I typically do on social media, and my followers will know this. I think we're giving them too much credit. I think we give these food companies too much credit. I think it's more simple than even that. I think they're just creating a product that you like so that you'll buy it again. And call it an Oreo. Oreos are unreal, right? The problem with Oreos is they're very high in calories. I'm calling a spade a spade. They're very high in calories, and you're not stopping at 1, you're not stopping at 2. You're going to eat at least a row, if not 2 or 3. Now, I don't think that Christie's or the original Oreo, they design them to be addictive in nature. It's just, yes, the fact that you enjoy the food makes you want to go back to the food, and the fact that it's cheaper and more accessible, and it doesn't spoil, and you've never probably had a negative experience around it like you would with maybe eating a rotten fruit. All of these things combine into making it seem more.
Well, let's look at cigarettes. Let's look at cigarettes.
Yeah, sure.
Right? The CEOs of all the cigarette companies at one point stood up in front of Congress, put their hand up in the air, and promised or pledged or swore that cigarettes were not addictive.
Right.
And of course, we since then have disassembled all of that. So, you're probably too young, but Lay's potato chips their slogan was, "I bet you can't eat just one." And,
I do remember that. No, I do remember that. I do remember that, actually.
What I would say to you is, maybe they're not as diabolical as the cigarette companies, but the net effect, net effect on our culture is you can see the introduction of ultra processed foods and the obesity rate almost perfectly parallel. And
they do that with marketing, right? It's a lot with the marketing. It's for sure marketed to get you to buy more. There's no doubt about it.
Well, but the empty calories,
buy and eat more.
The empty calories stop the satiation response. So to your, by the way, I watched your YouTube on the use of was it Coke Zero versus water? So I'm going to try it, right?
Yeah.
I'm drinking lots of water.
Yeah.
Right. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting because, I take water and I add ocean spray, the 5 calorie
the
version.
Drops. Yeah.
And I just cut it 30 or 50, 50 or whatever. And it gets me to drink more is where I'm going. So the thing with Coke Zero is it doesn't have the caffeine. So you're not getting that metabolic impact of the caffeine. So it isn't just Diet Coke, because Diet Coke has caffeination, which creates a whole metabolic cycle where it's a diuretic and there's all kinds of things going on. With the Coke Zero, presumably it's not doing that. But you do get this combination.
With the zero. I mean, in Canada we have like a Coke Zero that still has some caffeine, but there is a zero caffeine version as well. Yeah.
Okay. Well, in America, I think it's all zero, but who knows?
Mhm.
Okay, so this is what was interesting is that the sweetness and the carbonation created a behavioral change that was after they ended the 12 weeks, those that felt the benefit of that
Mhm.
a sweet, bubbly drink retained it. And so they changed their behavior because of their body's response to that. It's
Yeah.
Pavlovian
And
on a certain level, right?
yeah, it really is. It's more behavioral, and they didn't feel like they were missing anything, right? That's
No,
it,
no,
right?
no.
Because they didn't feel like they were cheating. They didn't feel like they
Right,
were, suffering. They
right.
got to just enjoy, the same thing, but it's a little bit different. I also do have a YouTube video where I challenged my girlfriend. I don't know if you've seen that, but I
Yeah.
challenged my girlfriend and my mother to see if they could tell the difference between the classic test. Could they tell the difference between different Cokes, Pepsis,
Oh,
Diet
okay.
Coke?
Okay.
And
Okay.
from that moment on, my girlfriend was a hard, I can tell Coke, regular Coke is the best, And from that moment on, she's now consuming Diet Coke and Coke Zero because she could not tell the difference. Spoiler alert.
Well, they worked really hard on making that the case, right?
Yeah.
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 Well, I think Coke in Mexico still has sugar. So I grew up on Coke with sugar, and then they
Right.
switched to fructose in
Right.
America. And boy, I remember going, "What did they do to this?"
Hmm.
Well, at the end of the day, you can see where if it satisfies a certain thing. Where I'm going is the Coke Zero. It
Hmm.
hit a button. There's
Yeah.
that it hit a button, and for people who are trying to maintain a high level of hydration, which you mentioned protein, hydration, fiber, and sleep. Those are the four
Yeah.
kind of pillars and I'm like,
Yeah.
he gets it. He totally gets it because that's
Yeah.
literally the sleep. People don't really understand how critical sleep is to maintaining your weight because if
Yeah.
you're awake, you're going to eat.
Essential.
You're going to eat. If you're, and people don't realize you often eat because you're thirsty. And instead
Yep.
of really, one of the other guys I was talking to, he says it's the apple test. If you can say, well, I'll eat an apple and then I still want something more, you were hungry. But if you eat the apple and you've satisfied something, the apple's got, some fiber and whatever, and it's got some sugar in there. But
Hmm.
his point was, then you don't tend to keep eating
Yeah.
because, so there's a fruit response. We tend to do strawberries and raspberries in my house, but
Sure.
well,
Whatever. It's still, essentially a carbohydrate with some fiber and water. So
yeah,
it does the
yeah,
job.
yeah. Well, and the fiber content is higher in those two than
Correct. Yeah.
than
And they're lowering calories for the
right.
volume as well,
So
if we're
yeah.
going to be super specific. But
Well, why not, right?
yeah, exactly.
It's the
Exactly.
introduction of fiber. People need to understand it helps balance the response of the body to the sugar.
100%.
Maybe, well,
Yeah.
please go into that a little bit because I don't think.
Yeah. So I love your point about the sleep. And it's something that I'm trying to really find an effective way to communicate it a little bit better online. But what people don't understand is on top of, and you touched on this very briefly there, is that when you don't sleep, let's take the example of you don't go to bed at a reasonable time. You're up, let's say, working late till 1, 2 in the morning. Well, you're going to be awake more hours. And that just means you're going to be fighting the temptation of boredom or mindless eating. By the way, mindless eating is a book that I would recommend anyone that's listening to go read. It's I think the layman would understand it quite well. It doesn't require any literature interpretation, but it teaches you how we make these decisions around food more or less subconsciously, and it'd be a great way for you to just understand ways in which you can limit your mindless eating. And anyway, so if you're back to my example, if you were up till 1, 2 in the morning, yes, you're probably going to be higher likelihood of eating something. When you eat something, it's likely going to have calories, right? You're not going to grab an apple at 2 in the morning. But if you do, great, but not likely, right? So that's one facet where it impacts. The other facet is we actually have so much literature. We have so much strong literature to suggest that when we don't sleep an adequate amount, we actually impact our food decisions. So it's not, that 2 a.m. day, it's the next day. We've only slept 3-4 hours, let's say, wake up, go to work. We're going to be fighting food decisions that we're going to struggle with the next day, the day after that, the day after that. And so on top of potentially opening up you to an opportunity to eat more the day that you're not sleeping, it's the following days that'll also be impacted as well. And on top of that, there's more nuance towards your inability to utilize certain nutrients when you're, for your recovery, when you're not sleeping well, and therefore your ability to build muscle is also diminishing due to lack of sleep. And the other thing we do know is people with increased muscle mass have an easier time of dealing with weight loss. So, protein goes into building muscle. Most people are in the US not coming even 60% of the way to eating their adequate protein intake. So, what I typically recommend to people is in metric, but I'll translate it for you guys as well. It's usually 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day, despite the RDA being 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. What you should be eating in pounds is like 0.7 to 1 gram of protein per pound of your body weight. So that is going to help with, on top of being satiating, if you're trying to be more physically active, it's going to help to fuel those muscles. But I cannot walk past the fact that the satiation bit, if you're eating like 0.3 grams per meal, 0.3 grams per kilogram of your body weight per meal. So myself, I weigh 220 pounds, or I weigh like around 100 kilos. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to eat at minimum 30 grams plus per meal across 3 to 4 meals in a day in order to feel full and satisfied after my meal, but also have just enough protein available to build muscle, because protein is the only macronutrient that can actually build muscle or act in muscle protein synthesis. So that's incredibly important. It's twofold, but it's incredibly important. And the other thing that's incredibly important is fiber, as you mentioned. Hydration is also important for different, things, and I'll kind of touch on that quickly. But hydration, if you're hydrated, you're not likely, as you mentioned earlier, going to be mindless eating as often. The other thing about hydration that's incredibly important is that when in sports specifically, it improves your utilization or your efficiency to utilize carbohydrates when you're exercising. So you can use your energy more efficiently when you're hydrated versus not. And then, we go to fiber. Fiber is something that is very challenging to communicate online now that there's been a massive boom, especially in the US, which is so frustrating. But there's been a big boom of this carnivore diet. And, no matter what way you look about it, it's probably the most restrictive and most dangerous diet fad that I've ever seen in my life. And anybody that's considering it should highly, I would highly recommend they look the other way, because while yes, you could eat all meat for a few days with no issues, maybe a week with no issues, that's anecdote. We know from the literature that that's not the way your body is. Your body is mainly run on glucose. Its primary energy source is glucose and carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are the easiest, most efficient way for your body to create energy. And I do agree that we consume a lot of added sugars in the classic Western diet, but we shouldn't go from an all, or eating like 500 grams of carbs per day, to a nothing. That is not the solution. So I think people should be, and the reason why I touched on fiber, because that diet would have very little fiber. And we know that, especially with emerging literature in gut health, first of all, when people use that as a buzzword online, many people that talk about gut health online don't know anything about gut health. And here's a good one for your followers, is that a good test is to ask someone 3 parts of the gut. See if they can name 3 anatomical parts of the gut if they're talking about your gut health. That's always a good test to see where you're getting your information from. Most of them just know gut health. But the actual gut flora, or the bacteria available in your small intestine, et cetera, is very new research. When we find this research, we're in the current stages, and I have a few friends who are in this line of work where we don't know if these increases or decreases in bacteria are good or bad things yet. That's how novel it is. But we do know that there's a connection between both your brain and your gut. That we've known for years. And we also know that with more fiber, we typically have improvements in gut health from what we know now currently. With more fiber, there are improvements, and there are also improvements in mental health, which is that gut axis barrier, or that gut axis, which the mind gut axis is what they call it. So we do know that there are improvements in that. And on top of that, there are other improvements like improved bowel movements, improved decreased consumption of overall calories. So if we're dealing with obesity and diabetes, we know that there's also improvements in blood glucose control with increased fiber diets. So I think a good recommendation for anyone watching at home.
Right, the fiber itself.
So that's a great point. It does two things. There's two different types of fiber: soluble and insoluble. Soluble is things like your chia seeds and et cetera. I always use the example of chia seeds because people know of chia pudding. Right. And chia pudding, what it does is you see it form a gel, right? Well, chia seeds or soluble fibers do that same thing in your gut. And by having more soluble fibers, it forms a gel inside your gut, which is actually a good thing, because the way that your gut is shaped, you actually can't absorb nutrients unless you have more surface area covered for the nutrients to be absorbed through. So that being said, that soluble fiber improves your ability to absorb valuable nutrients that your body needs. And then the kicker is the insoluble fibers, which is the one that most people know about, is the one that just comes and pushes it all through. So soluble fibers slow down the movement, as you mentioned, and insoluble fibers kind of help to keep it regular, help keep it moving through the gut, which they both serve almost opposing roles in the digestion process, but they're both incredibly important in the overall digestion of your food. And so, the kind of classic recommendation across the board is to consume about 14 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories that you consume. So if you're consuming 2,000 calories and trying to lose weight, your goal should be, to consume anywhere between like 28 to 32 grams of fiber if possible, which is challenging. Don't get me wrong, it's challenging, but that's also the difference between optimizing, and not. And that said, sometimes you won't hit it, but at least if you're getting closer, you're doing better than you were before, right?
I bought this domain the other night. I was up, and it's well weight.
Okay.
And I want to coin the term because people need to understand weight itself is not an answer. It actually has no direct correlation to your wellness. But your well weight is a combination of your body composition with primarily your A1C, but your bloods. So the notion that I'm working on getting across to people is everybody wants to know, what should I weigh? If you ask anybody, they'll and do I weigh too much? Do I weigh too little? What should I weigh? Do I get there? All that sort of thing. And the answer is obviously it's individual, but it's a combination of your body composition. And there's a thing called skinny fat, where people have visceral fat, but they're skinny, right?
Yeah.
And if they don't know their body composition, they can develop fatty liver and all that great stuff. And meanwhile, people who are actually pretty muscular don't necessarily have that much fat, but their weight. So that's where the BMI measurement is a flaw on the individual level. It's not really. So anyway, the redefinition.
Well,
what do you think of this?
I'd love to touch on that. I'd love to touch on that quickly, because the BMI was never intended to be a individualized measurement. It's actually a public health measurement, right? So to see the overall kind of idea of how our public looks, right? So and I love that you brought that up, because the BMI, based on the BMI, I'm morbidly obese,
right?
On average. And if any of you guys head on over to my Instagram, occasionally my shirt is not on, so you will see that
Matthew McConaughey.
But you will see that at my heaviest I'm around 240, 245, but I still maintain visible abs. And I'm not saying that to be braggadocious. I'm just saying that to help people understand that yes, I see the BMI and I see it. It impacts me, and unhealthy according to the BMI. But when I go to my doctor, they go, "Oh man, that is a very high BMI." Oh, and they immediately change their script, which is
Sure.
unfortunately not the case for a lot of other people. And I know that doctors don't treat everyone equally, but what I want to say with that is not to fear your doctor, but instead to say that you're right. That measurement is not very great,
No.
for everyone on an individual basis, but it is, one data point out of many data points that help us to better understand your health, much like you were talking about. There's so many different factors that help you better understand your well weight. And in the same case here, your BMI is not the only thing that should be, the only focus of your health.
Your percent body fat and your A1C. Those are the two on a typical, broadly applied. Those
Sure.
are the two single metrics that would have the greatest impact if they're applied. Because, honestly, I mean,
I wouldn't, that'd be an area of research that I'm unfamiliar with, that we would need to look at, I guess, more moving forward. But I'm sure they would be helpful far more than just people looking at their weight on a scale, for sure.
Well, yeah, and people know that because they're buying scales now that ineffectively show their percent body fat, and those are pretty untrustworthy for the most part. There are
inconsistent as well. Yeah.
Well, that's it, because I have one of those scales for the house, and I was measuring myself at 30% body fat, and then I went to an actual scientific measurement, and it was
DEXA scan?
6. Not even. It's called a Sika, and they have a body. It doesn't use any radiation; it just uses the galvanic skin response. So I mean, measuring your electrical resistance in your body. But it's been shown to be 97% as accurate as an MRI, which is far more accurate than a DEXA. DEXA has, anyway, there's all kinds of things that it doesn't do. So
right, yeah, that's true.
So what we're learning, and I love the fact that you used well weight. It does kind of roll off the tongue, right? What is your well weight? Because that's what people individually want to know. I mean, because we're all different sizes and different makes and so on, but we all want to know what's the right measurement for me. And so, if you would, what I'm promoting is this whole notion of well weight, and I would love for you to dive into that next time we talk. The other thing is the thermogenic effect of food. What people don't realize is that protein takes 30% of the energy that's in the protein to digest the protein. So you almost get a discount built in.
It is a discount. Yeah, that's a great.
You get a caloric discount, right?
Yeah.
Carbohydrates about 10%. Now fat. This is why you can smell fat that goes on your body. It's 1 to 3% of the energy that's in the fat is used to metabolize the fat, which is
and that's why earlier when you made the comment about ultra processed foods and mentioned the sugars, I wanted to make sure I highlighted the fats as well, because it's the combination of the two that's I don't want to call it an incredibly lethal combination, because I don't want people to fear fats. Fats are also important for delivering nutrients, but you are very good at absorbing most of the nutrients from the fat you consume.
Well, and also when the body has enough carbohydrates, it instantly stores the fat. The only time it actually doesn't store fat is when there's a caloric deficit, and actually a carbohydrate deficit in your bloodstream. That creates the ketosis, the effect of ketosis. That's when your body switches over to using fat instead of carbohydrates. But our bodies really run on carbohydrates. Brain uses 30% of the carbohydrates which we ingest. It's just like this little furnace up there burning carbohydrates.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, and you having to deal with diabetes, your body's ability to balance the carbohydrates that are effectively the sucrose is running through your body, dextrose, versus what's being absorbed by the cells. What does that? Well, the pancreas it releases the insulin that then manages the absorption. And you don't get enough insulin, you can go into insulin shock, and there's a whole other side to it.
Yeah.
I don't think people quite realize the delicate balance you have to maintain, because how critical it is to to manage that carefully?
Yeah, I mean, a perfect, anecdotal, but a perfect experience to kind of highlight that is the other day, I was showing you this earlier, is that I just finished my first half marathon, and I ran the BMO Vancouver half marathon, and that was on Sunday 2 days ago, so I'm still very sore. I got to realize how quickly your body is, as a diabetic or non, but for me, my pancreas isn't doing it alone. Mine is doing it with some enhancements, whereas the average individual would be doing the same run and doing all the same processes, but the body would be efficiently handling it. And, it's quite interesting to watch my blood sugar go from at the beginning of the race, I took no insulin and bumped it all the way up to 19.2, which is not, I don't know the exact conversions for the American system, but it's quite high and incredibly high out of range. But it went all the way up from there to a low near the end. So it's quite wacko to see how fast your body can cycle through that many carbohydrates when you're physically active as well. And you're right. It's quite interesting. If I was maintaining at that 19 for a long period of time, you're right. My cells would be like screaming, "Hey, give us more glucose, give us more glucose." But I have so much extra, right? I have so much extra to give, but just because I don't have that little key that opens the gate that lets it all through, which is insulin in this case, the cell doesn't see it, right?
Yeah.
And so as a result, both one side has too much, the other side doesn't have enough, and it's a weird situation that just this little thing. It's amazing. This little thing can unlock many doors in that case.
Well, and honestly speaking, it's allowed you to live a normal life. I mean, for all intents and purposes,
100%.
I mean, you're semi-pro or whatever you want to call it, tennis player. It's a very tiny percentage of people who play tennis reach that level.
Yeah,
and to surmount the physical conditions that you had to deal with, that's terrific. And I know there are a couple professional athletes who are type 1, that they were able to make it all the way there. Now, with type 2, it is possible to reverse diabetes. And depending on what degree of diabetes you've reached, to your point, if you're an insulin diabetic, meaning you're having to use supplements, it's rare or very, very rare that somebody's able to fully reverse that type 2 diabetes. Hopefully they'll
I'm not familiar with the numbers, but yeah, you're right. Yeah.
It's hopefully they can get it to where they can use a metformin or something. But at the end of the day, a pill is better than a stick, and but nothing's better than all of it, right? So the question is, how do people face so one of the things that we try to do is have each of our guests give us a shout out, and I would love to record that with you now. Is that diabetes is a medical condition, not a character. Obesity is a medical condition, and as a person who's dealing with diabetes, it perfectly makes sense.
Hi, my name is Edin Sehovic from Evidence Nutrition, and I just wanted to let you guys know that I am more than happy to support the NFL alumni in their initiative of reminding people that obesity is not a character flaw. Obesity is a medical condition.
Amen to that. Is your model individual coaching, or is it group, or is it combination? What is your?
So it's predominantly one-on-one, but I am trying to, because of my limited time and limited reach, I am trying to incorporate a group model, but that's yet to come. So I do a little bit of one-on-one. Most of my stuff is subsidized by my B2B anyway. I predominantly work in supplement creation, I guess, and formulation and that kind of thing. So as well as I run a fitness department in person for a country club here. So I wear a lot of hats, but that's and on top of that, I try to just educate people for free online so that they can have the education without having to pay the price or intimidation of big name brands.
Yeah, I don't think people realize, having studied exercise physiology and psychology, it is absolutely the intersection of both that makes the difference.
And if you look at emerging literature, it supports what you have to say. Is dealing with obesity one of the best? We have comparison studies to show the difference between supportive environment and one that's less supportive, let's call it. It's most, I forget what the number was, but it was a large, staggering majority of the people that were obese in the supportive environment were far more successful in their weight loss journeys and obviously maintaining the weight loss, which is quite a different feat in and of itself. Were far more successful in a supportive environment versus the one where, they were not supported or talked down to. So people as human beings don't typically do well when they're not being supported. So,
oh yeah, no, it's no question. And the whole thing about food itself is it releases endorphins, and it feels so good. I mean, there's that
that's true.
satisfaction that you feel, and one of our guys, he's in a challenge, 8-week challenge right now. He's doing a whole, it's called E2M, eager to motivate, and it's group-based training. But anyway, I'd love to promote you. I would love to think that there is an audience specifically dealing with the condition of diabetes that needs to be reached. That is, because you have a different challenge than just someone who is, and so as a marketing kind of guy, my suggestion is you begin to, you obviously are leveraging it, but you really begin to serve that audience, because it really isn't any coaches out there that we've run into that are dealing with that. Now, obviously, the side of it is you're dealing with performance athletes, so it's kind of cool. It's very cool.
It is. It's a fun. I mean, I love all my guys. So if any of them end up seeing this, I love pulling their leg a little bit too, because they are the biggest divas that pay the least. So I do love pulling their leg a little bit. But while athletes are fun, and that was always the way that I wanted to go with it, it's I have noticed a large following bump recently in general, but also one of the diabetic community. So nothing warms my heart more than getting those nice messages of, I inspired someone, or I taught someone something, especially if they're a type 1 or type 2 diabetic. And I taught them maybe that running a marathon is possible, or half marathon, or being normal is possible. So those messages do, go a long way, and I do appreciate them. So it helps.
One of my friends, and really the guy who brought me to the NFL alumni, is a guy named Otis Anderson. And Otis was Super Bowl MVP for Super Bowl 25. He was the first big running back, gained 10,000 yards. I mean, rookie of the year, comeback player of the year, MVP of the Super Bowl, 2 rings. Guy should be in the Hall. But he's a really great guy. And in our first wellness challenge, which was back in 2014, Otis showed me this picture of his washboard abs, right, as a player.
Yeah.
At that stage, he was closing, around 300. So, he went into the challenge, and we had a doctor that was looking at his bloods, and she was saying, well, you realize you're about 2/3 of your pancreas is no longer functioning. And it was like in that moment, he realized, his whole life changed. Actually, it was kind of your life sucks moment, right? Because, and it took him a period of time to really, and he went to the doctor. He's on metformin, and he's managing it. And I went out. We did the City of New York gave us the Tackle Obesity proclamation for the month of April.
Oh, wow.
We got it on World Obesity Day, right?
Wow.
Which was super cool. And he and I went out for coffee afterwards, and I had something to eat, and he was like so careful. And I was like, wow, this doesn't look like the guy I knew, because he had really begun, throughout, and this is, 7-8 years difference in time. He had really taken control of his life. It was so inspiring. He was so conscious that, this was going to impair him if he didn't get his handle on it. And as an athlete, as a winner, as a person who had been, the best there is at what he did, it's inspiring. So I would love to maybe even have him on when we're together.
I would love to. Awesome. Yeah, I would love to. I think Diabeto Nation, as I like to call my followers who are diabetic.
There you go.
Diabeto Nation. And, this is based on a character from Family Guy who makes about 4 seconds of airtime ever in their entire show's history. My friends started calling me Diabeto, and it's stuck ever since. I'm
Oh,
actually
that's
getting
awesome.
a license plate for my car that says
There you
Diabeto
go.
on it. But yeah, Diabeto Nation needs to remember that you just got to treat it like an athlete does. You pick your F word, fit or fat, and you decide which one you want to be. And, you can decide that, I don't want to simplify it as something as easy as that, but at the end of the day, it's you pick your suck, whether you want to suck in the sense of, you're overweight, you're struggling with this, that, and the other thing, medical conditions, or you pick your suck where you're exercising a lot, which takes a lot of time out of your day. Absolutely. You're, picking different foods, which maybe wouldn't have been like your first choice because you now need to cook or now need to prepare meals or need to think about making your protein and fiber intake. But you pick your suck. Either way, you're going to have to sacrifice a little bit of your life one way or another. You have type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, you have to sacrifice, but you pick your suck and you stick to it. And hopefully you pick the better of the two sucks.
Terrific. Well,
Yeah.
and go ahead and give one more shout out to your website, your Instagram account, and what you're doing, and invite out everyone that's listening to sign up and be part of your program.
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, I'd like to shout out my internet provider for not holding up my end of the bargain on that one. No, but I'd like to shout out if any of you guys would like to follow. My name is Edin Sehovic, and I am the founder of Evidence Nutrition, which is my tagline on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and YouTube at Evidence Nutrition. And I like to make free nutrition information that is evidence-based, accessible to everyone. And I like to be the Noah's Ark, if you will, bringing you to the evidence-based information that's otherwise tough to digest or understand sometimes. So I like to be that bridge to bridge that gap.
Just remember, more fiber. It'll be easier to digest.
For sure. It'll make the information far more easy to digest. Yeah.
All right, Ed. This big bump, bro. And
thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we'll stay in touch. I'd love to meet you in
sure.
person if I can when we're up in Vancouver.
For sure. You let me know. I'll be around.
Will do.